Hi, welcome back to Podcasting on a Plane. This is a view of aviation from both sides of the mic, where we give you straight talk about aviation from as many angles as possible. My name is Brandon Gonzalez, currently an air traffic controller at a busy general aviation airport on the West Coast. I have an almost 25-year background in aviation as a controller, as a pilot, as a flight instructor on 141 Check Airman, aircraft sales manager, ramper for a major airline, 2 of them actually, FBO line service guy, etc., etc. And since we talk about aviation from so many angles, if there's one I'm missing, well, the request lines are open 24/7 at podcastingonaplane.com/contact. While you're there, you can learn about me, the guests we've had, listen to past episodes. You can record an audio message and feedback for the show. You can send me an email, and you can learn how to become a valued supporter on Patreon. And I'd like to thank all of my generous patrons for keeping the show on the air. And as promised, my higher level patrons get a shout out and thank you regularly on the show. So to Paula Vince, Brian Juarez, Jeff Riolo, thank you guys for keeping the show in the air. And if you want to learn more about Brian Juarez, you can check him out on episode 21. And if you want to learn about Jeff and Empower UAV, go all the way back to episode number 7. If you want to talk with me, podcastingonaplane.com/contact is where you can do that. I can help you supplement your training if you like, give you a little ATC perspective, whatever you need. And speaking of ATC stuff, remember last time we talked about how the whole privatization battle was more or less over for the time being, but that it'll probably be back again sooner or later, right? Well, minutes before I sat down to record this episode, I got a tweet from my friend Rob over at Flying Magazine, and he just wrote a little piece about how ATC reform is still very much something that's in the White House's plan. And there's, of course, a link to the article in the show notes. So, before we get to the rest of today's planned content, guess what? I'm going to read it. The article is called ATC Privatization. It's back. Pros and cons of the reform effort will again be up for debate, by Rob Mark. In late April, much of the industry began breathing a sigh of relief that House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee Chairman Bill Schuster's last-minute attempt to reintroduce a plan to separate the nation's air traffic control system from the FAA's core infrastructure role was pulled by the Pennsylvania congressman. But now, just 60 days later, a White House plan called Delivering Government Solutions in the 21st Century has again reintroduced the idea, this time through a reorganization of the U.S. Department of Transportation. Although the plan says the Department of Transportation doesn't really need a major reform, it does label the FAA's operation of the nation's air traffic control system as in need of a, quote, significant realignment within the DOT. At the risk of sounding redundant, the plan says spinning off responsibility for ATC to a nonprofit organization will, quote, better enable our aviation system to respond to consumer needs and modernize services, end quote. The separation will also allow the new ATC system to create, quote, better governance structures and insulation from the political system while allowing them to better assess fees based on actual usage of the system, end quote. The plan says credibility for the idea is simple because approximately 60 other countries around the world have shifted their responsibilities to non-governmental providers. As in earlier proposals, the White House plan offers no details about how the separation would actually occur or when. That lack of details alone was enough to quickly mobilize the aviation industry alphabet groups to pen a statement calling reintroduction of the ATC privatization corporatization plan a, quote, failed proposal. The group, comprised of the AOPA, NBAA, EAA, GAMA, HAI, and the National Transportation Association, said, quote, instead of focusing precious time and resources on what amounts to nothing more than a distraction to the aviation community, the administration needs to support a long-term FAA bill like those passed by the House of Representatives, and now pending in the Senate. These bills will take practical and significant steps to assess many critical issues, like aviation safety and modernization, which includes accelerated advancement of the next-generation air transportation system, NextGen, and needed aircraft certification and regulatory reform. Additionally, the Department of Transportation needs to continue its commitment to the NextGen Advisory Committee that fosters collaboration in an open and transparent manner and helps advance air traffic control modernization priorities and investments, end quote. The Reason Foundation's Director of Transportation Policy, Bob Poole, a solid proponent of ATC corporatization, told Flying he too was surprised by the White House plan to reintroduce air traffic control reform. Poole said he quickly learned the Office of Management and Budget had actually, quote, been working on the effort for the past 18 months. End quote. In his monthly newsletter, Poole said changes to the ATC system are hardly a given even in a world where Republicans control all 3 branches of government. Quote, in the hyper-partisan atmosphere in Congress today, good government reforms that make a world of sense are likely to be championed by those of the president's party and damned by the opposition. But even without that, there's the tyranny of the status quo. Congressional Appropriations Committee members from both parties in both houses of Congress have opposed ATC corporatization due to loss of turf, the opportunity to make policy by having control over the purse strings, end quote. The newsletter also suggested that, quote, perhaps there is now a chance for the Senate to come up with its own version of corporatization as part of the still-to-be-completed Senate FAA reauthorization bill, or at the very least to remove air traffic organization from the FAA and from civil service as a standalone DOT modal agency. That in itself would be a meaningful reform, end quote. Rob, awesome article as usual, and thanks for the heads up. All right, now to the regularly scheduled program. First, I support the Airline Pilot Guy show. It's a great group, and I'm happy to contribute in any way I can. Chances are you probably already listened to that podcast, but if you don't, go check it out. Every time I listen, I always learn something. And plus, it's just a great community. On their show, there had been a question kind of floating back and forth about ATC clearing aircraft to land while there's still another aircraft on the runway, and a few follow-up questions about how much spacing is actually required between different types of aircraft on the runway. So I left them an answer in the form of an audio feedback, and since it actually fits in perfectly with the content of this show, obviously, I thought I'd play it for you here. Hey, APG community, Brandon here live from the tower, and I've got a few things to say about that question that's been circulating around for a while about the towers clearing aircraft to land with another one still on the runway. Well, fellow CFI John, here's your answer. His local tower mentioned the 3,000-foot rule between small aircraft, and yes, that's of course correct, but let me expand on it for a minute. 3,000 feet is what we use between small aircraft, and small in ATC language means single-engine airplanes like Skyhawks, Bonanzas, Cherokees, and even the small turboprops like Meridians, TBMs, and a Pilatus too. We call these Cat 1 aircraft. All helicopters also fall into that category. There are two more categories, Category 2, which is light twins, and Category 3, which includes all jets, which obviously require a lot more spacing, 4,500 feet and 6,000 feet, and airborne, respectively, for those two categories. Separately, if there's in-trail wake turbulence separation required, a controller would need to factor that in as well. But don't worry, I won't get into that this time. One of a tower's main objectives is to provide runway separation. Whether it's arrival-arrival, arrival-departure, or departure-departure, what matters most is what kind of aircraft is in the back, the successive one, so to speak. If a Cessna 172, for example, is the one in the back, 3,000 feet's enough. If the successive aircraft is a Category 2, something like, a Seneca or an Aztec, 4,500 feet then would be required. And if either one's a Cat 3, front or back, then the front aircraft would need to be 6,000 feet down the runway and also airborne, or else the landing aircraft would need to be sent around. If the runway's less than 6,000 feet long, though, past the departure end is considered sufficient. So, that's that for distance. But the point of the question, I know, was about whether or not you can clear an aircraft to land with one still on the runway. And the answer, of course, is yes. But what we call it is anticipated separation, which is just what it sounds like. Anticipated separation means that you can issue a clearance as long as the prescribed separation will exist when the arriving aircraft crosses the threshold. For example, if an aircraft checks in with me at the tower on, a 10-mile final, let's say, if there's no reason to withhold the landing clearance, I'll clear them to land. If an aircraft will depart on that aircraft's landing runway after the landing clearance has been issued, but before the arriving aircraft lands, I have to inform them that traffic will depart prior to their arrival. If I decide to sequence another airplane in front of them, I don't also have to take away their landing clearance, I just have to inform them of their new sequence. Make sense? When things get complicated, though, sometimes is lineup and wait procedures. At large airports that have ground radar, which is called ASDX, you can clear an aircraft to land and then have another one lined up in position. At airports like mine, though, which do not have ASDX, you may line up an aircraft and wait with another one on final. However, you cannot issue the landing clearance to the landing aircraft until the one you put in position is not only cleared for takeoff, but also starts their takeoff roll. So putting it all into practice then, when the traffic pattern gets really busy at my single runway airport, my job is to sequence arriving aircraft and, of course, leave enough space to depart aircraft in between arrivals if needed. The other day, I worked a really busy session where I was able to sequence and clear 6 aircraft to land in order, anticipating, of course, that at the time each one crossed the threshold, that the previous aircraft would either be far enough down the runway or clear of it entirely. And if that isn't the case, well, then I'd have to send the next arrival around. But no matter how you look at it, that's 6 arriving aircraft, each with their preceding aircraft to follow in sight, and each with landing clearances. And every single one of them is going to have somebody ahead of them on the runway at some point, right? There isn't really an upper limit to how many airplanes you can do that with either, just the limitations of visual separation, and of course your own ability as a controller to keep it all straight. All right, well, if that was a question that you had, I hope that answered it for you. Now, the other week I gave a talk at a 99 seminar, and it was about flying companions. It was an all-day seminar, although my part was only about 25 minutes, but it was for those people who are around people like us, people who fly all the time. And there were subject matter experts from just about every topic. Most were CFIs, but all were current pilots and industry experts. I was the ATC guy from the local tower, of course, which is a role I'm used to playing, but I gave a talk about how we do our job, and we had a great time. One of the attendees is working on his private pilot's license, and he had his granddaughter in attendance. So we didn't really talk much that day, of course, but we ran into each other a few days later at a flying club event. He told me he had some stuff that he wanted to talk about and he'd send me an email. Well, a couple days went by, I thought maybe he forgot, but he sent me that email all right, and I'm about to share it with you. And after some really high-quality buttering up, he asks what's actually a pretty serious question that's probably a common struggle for most student pilots. You guys ready to hear it? Okay, here we go. All right, this email is from Ben. He says, "Hi, Brandon. We met at the PC Flyers barbecue, and I was with my granddaughter at the 99's companion event. I just wanted to reiterate my gratitude for doing this podcast service and presentations you do to the aviation community in general. I think it bears repeating, so thanks. It's been educational, entertaining, and at times eye-opening. Kudos. You're a talented young man." Oh, gosh. Okay, enough buttering up. I listened to one of your podcasts, and it hit on a friend of yours you mentioned when he switched flying schools to the flying club atmosphere, much out of frustration as anything else. I'm not wanting to switch my CFI or even my learning situation, as I very much enjoy the learning experience and atmosphere she provides. However, I'm getting frustrated with my learning curve, if you will. I feel as if I've never struggled to learn anything complicated in my life, but this is a whole different animal. I've hit a really bad plateau that's becoming expensive and frustrating to get off of. Yes, that's right. It's all about landing this plane. I don't seem to be getting any better at it. 25 hours in, and it seems like I'm still trying to land the same as hour 2. I just don't seem to be able to develop a feel for the transition, for that last little bit of altitude that'll be the difference between a firm landing versus a hard landing. Or worse yet, the ballooning, floating, nose wheel first bounce and then decide to go around kind of landing. By the time I figure it out, I'm off the center line. And I recognize it in my brain, but I'm 2/3 of the runway one side or the other. I don't want to quit. I've never quit anything in my life except smoking. As hard as that was, it was easy compared to this, or so it seems. I just don't know what to do to try to help this along aside from just keep doing it until you get better. I keep hearing about how everyone else goes through this, and they learned it, so keep going. But it honestly has lost its fun factor. It's not fun going up twice a week and returning frustrated every time. It's actually kind of heartbreaking. I've never been so inept at learning anything in my life, and I guess that's the toughest pill to swallow. Any advice you could offer would be greatly appreciated. Best regards, Ben. Man, okay, well, Ben, first, I appreciate the kind words, but more importantly, thanks for the excellent question. You're certainly not the first or last person to have this issue. You know, there's an old saying in flying that flying is the second greatest challenge, but landing is the first. And another old saying goes, if it was cheap and easy, everyone would do it. But yeah, this is a really frustrating skill that everyone struggled with at some point. And you're completely right that it's a plateau, and I'm glad that you recognize that. So what I think you need is a little fresh bit of perspective. So hopefully I can give that to you. Let's dig into this a little bit deeper. First off, unless you rely on luck, any decent landing is going to start with a stabilized approach. And this is a term you've probably heard before in your training, but while the term sounds like something that's, easily definable enough and solid, if you ask me, it really isn't. It's actually a pretty soft term that means different things to different pilots, in different conditions, and in different types of aircraft. According to the FAA, in the Airplane Flying Handbook and some other safety briefing materials, a stabilized approach is one in which the pilot establishes and maintains a constant angle glide path towards a predetermined point on the landing runway. It's based on the judgment of certain visual cues and depends on the maintenance of a constant final descent airspeed and configuration. Okay, well, I can't argue with that, but what does it mean to the pilot of a Cessna versus the pilot of a Boeing? Well, in most cases, how far out or how high up you are when you need to be stabilized is the biggest difference. Most of the FAA texts that discuss this say that in IFR conditions, you should be stabilized by at least 1,000 feet above the touchdown zone. And for visual approaches, you should be stabilized by 500 feet above. And right there is where stuff usually starts going wrong. What is it that happens at 500 feet above in most training aircraft? Well, you're usually on base, or maybe just inside a 2-mile straight in. And this is where you add that little second notch of flaps usually, right? Well, a great deal of student pilots, myself included once upon a time, often find themselves either high or fast, or both, right about here. And what do? Well, they look at the airspeed indicator. They realize they're too fast for that second notch, and they raise the nose in order to slow down. Well, you'll slow down all right, but guess what? Now you're not a little high, you're a lot high. And now we have a too steep approach, which either requires more flaps or a forward slip. The power comes to idle and down we go. Often this is rationalized by the pilot saying things like, well, yeah, the approach is steep, but hey, it's constant, and I'll make the touchdown point. Okay, well, true as that may be, at some point on short final, we're going to have to reapply a bunch of power to arrest the descent, and then play guess how much to flare game, which almost never results in the touchdown you want. The moral of the story is that the backbone of the stabilized approach, per its own definition, is the proper glide path, be it the VASI slope, the PAPI slope, the ILS, VNAV glide path, or just a little mental math that you did in your head. But staying on the proper path is step one. If you're in a Skyhawk or a Cherokee or pretty much any draggy, light, single-engine airplane, if you have the power at idle and you're on a 3-degree glide path, which incidentally is optimal for old-school swept-wing jets, not straight-wing trainers, Well, you're going to slow down all right. And as you reach the proper flap extension speeds, you just add them in. But raising the nose and sacrificing your glide path for a few knots and then committing yourself to a steep approach path just isn't the way to do it. If you're so fast and so high that you can't slow down in a Cessna at idle power, well, guess what? It's already time to go around. Okay, so let's say we got that nice stabilized approach thing going, and that's not the issue. Assuming there isn't a bunch of wind or turbulence or anything like that, we actually don't have much to do except flare a little bit and land nicely. So one technique that I use in most piston singles is to add a little bit of nose up trim when I'm on short final, so that I have to add just a little forward pressure actually to keep the nose down. And then that way, I'll have a more neutral feel on the yoke as I pull the power to idle as I get into ground effect to flare. Now this allows me to have a light grip, and then my inputs are going to be better judged than if I needed to grip the yoke hard. And I know what you're about to say, and here's my word of caution about it. If you were to go around, your application of full power, if you have some nose up trim in, would of course result in the nose coming up pretty fast. And then the concern would be to avoid a trim stall. So just remember, if you do use this technique, if you have to go around or add power, realize that you're going to have to push forward pretty hard on the yoke, and you're going to have to get on the nose down trim quickly as well. Now, what I'm guessing is that you, Ben, when you start the flare, you're guessing how much. And if you're truly stabilized and have a really neutral trim state, you should be pretty easily able to perceive when you enter ground effect. And as soon as you do, you're going to slowly retard the throttle and hold the nose just so that you're barely still descending. And the wheels should just barely kiss the ground. And Ben, you also mentioned that you're having trouble staying on the center line. Well, assuming this isn't a crosswind technique issue, which is probably a topic for part 2 of this discussion, I often notice student pilots deviating off the left side of the center line for a different reason that you don't see coming. Now, you didn't mention a specific direction, but if it's to the left, I'm guessing that as you flare, you're pulling on the yoke a little bit with your left hand. And as you do that, there's a nearly imperceptible aileron input, usually to the left, that gets added. Or if it's to the right, a lot of us sometimes, as we pull on the yoke, you're subconsciously standing a little bit on the rudder pedals. And sometimes it's either the right one as you pull the throttle or the left one as you pull pressure on the yoke. So think about that too. You might be adding a little bit of final complexity in there with a control input you didn't know you were doing. And then, of course, it's going to result in a side-loaded touchdown somewhere off the center line. Okay, so those are all the symptoms, right? But is there some sort of therapy we can use to fix it? We need to find a way to help you recognize where ground effect is. And as you put it in your email, develop a feel for the transition, or that last little bit of altitude that's going to be the difference in a firm landing versus a hard landing. If you were my student, here's what we'd be doing. You've probably heard of or maybe even practiced that maneuver where you fly down the length of the runway in ground effect. That's usually the CFI's first go-to stop. And the maneuver is really good. It more or less forces you to recognize ground effect, and that's fine. But it actually misses a couple of points, and primarily the one you said you need, which is the feel for the transition. There is a way, though, and what I have my students do is basically a soft field takeoff procedure. Now, a little background for you. This usually comes in the second phase of training after you solo, but sometimes bringing a version of it in early can help. Now, during a soft field takeoff, you're simulating takeoff on a surface that you don't want the nose wheel to contact for very long, like wet grass. You lift the nose wheel off the ground as soon as airflow over the horizontal stabilizer and elevator is sufficient to lower the tail, and therefore raise the nose. You do something of a wheelie down the runway, balancing on the mains until the airplane's ready to fly. But it's still in ground effect. And then you keep it in that effect until sufficient airspeed is achieved to fly away safely. The maneuver basically mimics the landing flare, but during takeoff, albeit with a different flap setting. So the teaching technique I'm talking about is, I've used this with great success, actually. It's basically the same, but we're not going to be actually taking off. And for students who haven't reached stage 2 of their training yet, the technique I'm about to describe can often be really helpful. And here's what we do if I was your instructor. First, we'd pick an airport with a nice long runway. We'd ask the tower or advise the common traffic that we want to do a high-speed taxi. And I have my students line up on the runway, configured for landing though, trimmed a little bit nose up, flaps down, just like we talked about, and then add maybe 3/4 power and accelerate to just under liftoff speed as we go down the runway. The elevator is going to become effective enough to raise and lower the nose wheel off the surface of the runway and then set it down again. I have the student raise the nose and tell me when the nose wheel is off the ground. When they set it back down, I have them tell me when the nose wheel is back on the ground. And I have them feel how the pedals change feel when the nose is in contact versus when it isn't.
Show me penta fence, up, down.
The amount of elevator pressure required is nearly the same as for the landing flare, and the sight picture is spot on too. So we just go down the runway, lifting, lowering, nose up, nose down, right?
Up, down, up, down.
As the end nears, we slow and exit the runway wherever the tower tells us to do so. Do this a few times and your muscle memory is going to be honed perfectly for setting up the ideal flare. A few words of caution though. In addition to the usual disclaimer at the end of this podcast, I want to specifically add that this needs to be done with an instructor or safety pilot as appropriate who's familiar and comfortable with operating the aircraft this way. If there's a crosswind present, it can make for good training, but a gusty wind might mean that this isn't a good day to do this. The speed needs to be kept under control too. The point is to achieve a speed where you can raise and lower the nose, but not actually take off. This is a little bit easier in some airplanes than others, and as excited as you'll be that you're finally getting the hang of this landing thing, always keep track of how much runway you have left and know when it's time to stop. And lastly, make sure the tower and other traffic in the area know full well what your intentions are. All right, well, thanks, Ben, for the question. I hope that all helps. And if not, send me another email, and I'll try to do better next time. Patrons of the show on patreon.com are going to get a written post of this content, and the higher level patrons are also going to get personalized remote video mentoring sessions where we can talk about this kind of thing and any other aviation topic they want to discuss with me. And if you're interested in getting a little bit of that too, head over to podcastingonaplane.com/contact to schedule or podcastingonaplane.com/support to learn how you can become a valued supporter too. Patrons like Paula, Vince, Brian, Jeff, Jill, Darren, Derek, and Jake, well, they're also getting a steady feed of really interesting news that's relevant to aviation and air traffic control too. Anyway, that's it for this week. Until next time, make sure you follow along on Instagram using the hashtag podcastingonaplane, and like the Facebook page, and our Twitter @handle is podcastonaplane. And that way, you won't miss a thing. Until next time, good day. The Podcasting on a Plane podcast is presented for entertainment purposes only. My comments and those of my guests, the website's content, and any of the social media, etc. are not part of my official responsibility as a controller or an FAA employee. The views and opinions you hear on the podcast are mine and those of my guests, and not necessarily that of the FAA. There is no nexus between Podcasting on a Plane and the FAA. Also, while I am a CFI, I'm not your CFI. Nor am I your mechanic, your doctor, your shrink, or your spouse. This podcast is presented for entertainment, camaraderie, and fun, but is in no way, shape, or form professional advice. It's not legal counsel, and it's definitely not flight instruction. If you are in need of professional advice, get some from somewhere more appropriate than a podcast, no matter how good this one may be.